Okay, hi everyone. I suggest we get started. So, welcome to this webinar on the use of evidence reviews and field data collection to strengthen disaster preparedness and response. Now, before we get started, I'll shortly introduce myself and our department. I work for the Belgian Red Cross at a department called the Center for Evidence-Based Practice, which is also known as CEBAP. Um, this is oh, This is a picture of the entire CEBAP team. We are a team of 8 enthusiastic researchers, all with an academic background and a PhD, and we are responsible for the scientific underpinning of all activities of Belgian Red Cross. I myself am standing in the middle. My name is Kim, and I have the honors of presenting this webinar to you today. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, we would like you to send these to info@cebap.org. The email address will be visible throughout the entire presentation at the bottom of each slide. These questions will then be compiled by my colleague Anne-Catherine. The webinar will take approximately 1 hour and 10 minutes, so it's quite long. Afterwards, there is some time to ask questions, and we could also start up a discussion. I realize the presentation is quite long, but please bear with me, and I promise it will be worthwhile. So this is the content of today's webinar. We will talk about why we need scientific evidence, what is evidence-based practice, what research types exist and are being used by Belgian Red Cross, and how we can conduct type A, B, and C research in a humanitarian aid sector. And finally, we'll end with an overall conclusion. To start off with, why do we need scientific evidence? Well, humanitarian aid very much depends on expert opinion. We believe that experts with sufficient expertise in the field will know what to do. But expert opinion has its limitations. First of all, for many practical questions, there are often no clear-cut answers. We all know that different experts, different manuals, and different websites may have different opinions. And perhaps you can even think of a few examples where different NGOs have a different way of handling humanitarian aid in the field. The issue with this way of working is that it is often unclear which answer is best, which intervention is most effective, most cost-effective, and safest. So by relying solely on expert opinion, there is always a risk of choosing harmful, bad, or ineffective techniques or practices. And I will try to illustrate this by giving you an example. In 1946, a certain Dr. Spock published a book on baby and child care, and this book became one of the best-selling non-fiction books of all time. It's important to know that Dr. Spock was a physician who focused on pediatrics, so he was definitely an expert. And in his books, Dr. Spock advocated that babies should sleep on their tummies. His reasoning was that if babies were to vomit, they would be more likely to choke on the vomit if they were placed on their back. And this seems to be like a reasonable argument. However, we now know that this advice has led to the cot deaths of tens of thousands of infants. And below you can see a graph of the number of cot deaths in the Netherlands from 1980, when babies were still advised to sleep on their tummies, to 2008, when more and more parents were advised to let their babies sleep on their back. Now, the main lesson that we can draw from this anecdote is that theories about what works should be tested through systematic observations in humans. And if we fail to do so, this may lead to us doing more harm than good. In conclusion, this is the Dr. Spock we need, with his famous quote, "Insufficient facts always invite danger." And this is also the way we work at Belgian Red Cross. We want to see scientific proof before we recommend a certain intervention. And since we have been working like this, we have experienced several advantages. One of the most important advantages is that scientific evidence helps us to determine how to allocate the limited resources we have. The first step in providing humanitarian aid is to get funding, and I'm sure we all have the same issue, namely there is never enough money. So therefore, it will be key to figure out how to have as much impact as we can with the limited resources we have available, and scientific evidence could help us to do just that. Second, scientific evidence ensures that our interventions are based on objective proof rather than on subjective opinion. As I demonstrated before, subjectivity could lead to choosing the wrong intervention, the less effective intervention. But by relying on scientific data, we could avoid such subjectivity and ensure that we are implementing the best, most effective intervention possible. Third, it allows us to substantiate the choices we have made to donors. If we implement a certain intervention and we can prove by means of scientific evidence that this intervention is effective, safe, and maybe even cost effective, then this is crucial information that can and should be communicated to donors. It will increase the reliability of your organization. In fact, there are some organizations, such as effective giving or effective altruism, who focus on just that. These are people who want to give time or money to a good cause, but they want to give it to those causes that have most impact. In order to do so, they don't base themselves on feelings or empathy, but they rather use evidence and analysis to find the best causes and the best interventions to work on and invest in. This trend is becoming more and more popular in the last few years. And finally, it increases the chances to get funding. When you can profile yourself as a reliable, science-based organization, this will increase your odds of receiving funds. So now that we know that scientific evidence is important, the question is, how can we incorporate scientific evidence appropriately? At Belgian Red Cross, we base ourselves on evidence-based practice, or EBP. Evidence-based practice consists of 3 pillars: the best scientific evidence, the preferences of the target group, and the practical experience and expertise of experts in the field. It's important to realize that based on a Dr. Spock example I gave earlier, it's not our intention to dismiss expert opinion and input from the field altogether, but rather we should ensure that all 3 pillars are represented. I would like to show you a small movie to illustrate exactly how evidence-based practice works.
Hello and welcome to this video about evidence-based practice. Every year, the Belgian Red Cross publishes many guidelines and recommendations. In this video, we show you how we come up with these recommendations and what role evidence-based practice plays in this process. For example, suppose a little girl falls and scrapes her knee. There are various ways to treat her scrape, but which treatment is the most effective? There might be an old-fashioned remedy. Or you could of course wait for divine intervention. Or you might find a possible treatment on the internet. But at the Belgian Red Cross, we prefer to base our recommendations on scientific and evidence-based arguments. In other words, we look for scientific studies that compare the various ways of treating scrapes. It turns out that rinsing a scrape with saline solution is just as effective as rinsing it with tap water. Other scientific studies show that histatin, a protein found in saliva, can promote healing. We were unable to find any comparative studies on using disinfectants to treat simple scrapes. Scientific evidence is the first but not the only pillar supporting evidence-based practice. The second pillar is a panel of experts with practical experience who examine the scientific findings. In this case, the experts advise against using saliva because it contains too many bacteria. And disinfectants can delay the healing process, so experts advise against those too. The third pillar is the target audience, who also has a say in evidence-based practice. Little girls think putting saliva on a scraped knee is disgusting. What they really want is a princess plaster. But when it comes to the best way to cover a simple scrape, the science is not really settled. As you can see, evidence-based practice is based on 3 important pillars.
Hello.
Scientific evidence is the foundation. Expert opinion is the second pillar. And the preference of the target audience is the third pillar. Taken together, all this information and expertise leads to the following recommendation. Use tap water to clean a scrape. A message to all little girls: don't worry, the recommendations made by the Belgian Red Cross are all evidence-based. No little girls were harmed in the making of this video.
Okay, so in this example, an ordinary scrape was discussed, which is obviously not representative for the context of humanitarian aid, but the principle we work with remains the same. Namely, we use input from science, experts, and the target population to formulate guidelines and to decide on which interventions to implement. By using evidence-based practice, we could make humanitarian action more effective, more ethical, and more accountable. In a quote by Edward Deming, who is an American statistician, he said, "It's not enough to do your best, you must know what to do and then do your best." And this very well applies to humanitarian aid as well. However, what we see is that the humanitarian aid sector is very slow in adopting evidence-based principles. And there are several possible explanations for this phenomenon. I will only sum up a few of them, of which I believe are the most important ones. First of all, humanitarian aid is a very difficult setting to work in from a scientific point of view. Understandably, when disaster hits, doing research does not feel like a priority. It might even be unethical to perform a randomized control trial whereby you divide an area into an intervention and a control group. And these circumstances make it very difficult to do scientific research. However, the key message that we want to give with this presentation today is that it is not impossible. Second, this is a sector of little innovation, meaning that the interventions we apply are very basic. It's all about providing clean water, clothes, food, shelter, dead body management, and so on. This is not rocket science. There are no patents to be earned, and therefore there is little interest from academia, so most research will have to come from the NGOs themselves. Third, the local authorities are needed to enroll a scientific experiment. You will need their knowledge and their input in the field. However, local authorities are often not functioning following disaster, which will result in poor regulation and further decreases the possibility of gathering scientific evidence. There are also many players within the humanitarian aid sector, and there is a poor overall coordination. In Haiti, for example, 400 humanitarian actors were operational and 2,000 humanitarian agencies were involved to a varying degree. There is also the issue of funding. Funding is, first of all, never sufficient, and in addition to that, it may come from governments or private foundations who have their own agenda. And this agenda often does not involve research. Even the public expectation might have an impact on your decisions. There is also a lot of semantic confusion. Very often people tell me, "I have personally observed several times that." However, the plural of anecdote is not evidence. And this nicely illustrates that by relying on evidence-based practice, we try very hard not to solely rely on these anecdotes, but to add scientific evidence to the story as well. As Stephen Hawking once said, the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it is the illusion of knowledge. And this is exactly why we need evidence-based practice, to ensure that we gain true knowledge. Now, these are just a few reasons, and I'm sure that there are several others that I haven't mentioned, but the point is that scientific evidence is not easy to obtain within humanitarian aid. However, in the rest of my presentation, I will try to convince you that even though it's hard, it's not impossible, and I will give you some practical tools on how to incorporate science into your fieldwork. So how do we incorporate evidence-based practice within the Belgian Red Cross? In a first step, we wait for input from the operational services of Red Cross. As I explained earlier, CEBAP is a team of 8 very enthusiastic researchers. However, we have little knowledge of what goes on in the field. We don't know which research questions or topics need investigation, and therefore the research question has to come from the operational teams themselves. In a next step, the research question is presented to the steering group, and they try to get a better picture on the urgency of the topic, the potential impact on practice and society, the economic and financial impact on Belgian Red Cross, and the relevance for Belgian Red Cross. And based on these parameters, it is decided whether or not a research question deserves actual investigation. Such investigation may involve type A, type B, or type C research. And I will explain each of the research types in the upcoming slides. Type A research is the first one, and this involves planning, monitoring, evaluating, and reporting. It encourages us to collect data on the ongoing projects and interventions and to oversee its implementation and report on progress that has been made. For example, let's say a disaster hits and you decide to distribute chlorine tablets for safe drinking water. In this case, you might want to collect data on the number of tablets that were distributed, the number of tablets that were actually used by the population, and perhaps also take some water samples at the water source or at the household, depending on your intervention. These few measurements will give you a good indication on the progress you have made and whether or not implementation is going as planned. Also, if you notice that none of the tablets are being used and water samples are still showing high levels of contamination, this should tell you that your intervention is not working as planned and that you should adjust your strategy. A second type of research is type B research, and this one involves secondary research. It means that we won't start our own field studies, that we won't start collecting data, but that we will look in existing literature to find studies that have already investigated the research questions that we have. It is not always necessary to reinvent the wheel. In fact, in most cases, other people will have already looked into the same questions you have. And this is what we do when we try to create guidelines or systematic reviews. We look for existing research studies and try to put them all together to formulate one conclusion. Type C research involves primary research, and this means that we would set up our own field study. In such a field study, we compare an intervention group to a control group. At Belgian Red Cross, primary research is only done in very rare cases, when there is no or very limited scientific evidence available, and when the research question is of high priority to improve the workings of Belgian Red Cross. In the upcoming slides, I will explain how to conduct these different types of research and give you examples of ongoing projects at Belgian Red Cross. We'll start off with type A research, which involves the planning, monitoring, evaluating, and reporting. This is a first and fairly easy step towards improving your interventions. It does not require you to set up a field study with an intervention and a control group. It simply requires you to start collecting data and analyzing this data. But of course, there are good and bad ways to collect data. So how should you get started? First, it's important to formulate a research question. This may seem obvious, but this step is actually very often forgotten. Next, you need to ensure that you have a correct sample size estimate, select your sample randomly, prepare outcome measures, measure data at fixed time points, and analyze this data statistically. Ideally, you also share your results with the world by writing a report or scientific publication. In this way, other people can also benefit from the data you have collected and improve their interventions as well. I will discuss each of these steps in more detail in the upcoming slides. So, formulate a research question. This may seem obvious, but it's very often forgotten. So, people have the tendency to start collecting a lot of data, to ask people a lot of questions, but once the data have been collected, they are not sure exactly what to do with it. Or sometimes it's the other way around. After the data has been collected, they regret not asking certain questions. So the main message is sit down and think about what it is you want to know. What is the primary outcome of interest? What is the secondary outcome of interest? And what data should you collect in order to answer the research questions that you have? This preparation phase can easily take a few weeks or months, and it's absolutely crucial that you take sufficient time to prepare. Have a lot of discussions about it with other people, ask their input, and only until you get it right, you can move to the next step and start collecting data. So once you have formulated a research question and defined a primary outcome, you can use this outcome to calculate an appropriate sample size. A good data collection always starts with a sample size calculation. If you want to be able to draw conclusions from the data you have collected, it's important to have an appropriate sample size. And this sample size will differ depending on your objective. If you plan to only measure once, this is called a market survey, and then you will need a different sample size calculation than when you plan to measure twice or even more, or when you want to compare two or more groups over time, and so on. So each different objective will require a different sample size calculation. You could do a sample size calculation by means of statistical software or even in Excel, or you could rely on online tools such as samplesize.net. Sample size will depend on various parameters, and the first ones that I want to discuss are alpha and the power. Traditionally, alpha is always set at 0.05 when you're comparing two groups or when you're comparing a pre to post study. The power is always set at 80% or almost always set at 80%. Alpha indicates the level of significance. So when you're doing statistics and they tell you that your findings are significant from a p-value of 0.05, that is what the alpha represents. The power of 80% shows us the probability that a significant effect will be detected. So I won't go into much detail, but I assure you that these values are quite standard, and I wouldn't recommend changing these values if you are not a statistician and you don't have any clear arguments of why they should be changed. Next is the baseline value of a primary outcome. So I will try to explain this by means of an example. Let's say we want to apply an intervention, and at baseline, so prior to our intervention, 5% of the population has access to clean water. By means of our intervention, we hope to increase this number to 20% at endline. So we want to have an impact of 15%. We take a dropout rate of 10% into account. A dropout rate refers to the number of people that we expect to lose at endline. So if you include a certain sample at baseline, we can expect that by the second measurement, some people will have moved, other people won't want to participate, some people are ill. There are many reasons for why people don't want to participate at the endline measurement, but you should take a certain dropout rate into account. In this example, we set it at 10%. And then finally, the cluster refers to the size of your villages. Let's say we have 20 villages. Five villages have 200 households. Another 5 villages have 90 households. Another 5 villages 60, and then the last 5 villages have 50 households. This means that on average, a village size is 100 households big. So that is what the cluster refers to. Now, if we enter all of these numbers into a sample size calculator, we get that we need 790 households in order to reach statistical significance. I'll rephrase. So in order to be able to say that a 15% improvement, so from 5 to 20%, is statistically significant, we'll need a sample size of 790 households or more. To show you that a baseline score has a large impact, we've changed the baseline score from 5% to 50%. So prior to our intervention, 50% of the population has access to clean water. By means of chlorine tablets, we still hope to increase this number by 15%, which brings us to 65% at endline. You can see that this has a massive impact on our sample size, which is now 1,816 households. So the larger your baseline value, the larger your sample size will be. Another parameter that has an important impact is the amount of change you can achieve due to your intervention. So the impact that you can have. On the left side of the table, you can see the same example as before, but on the right side, you can see that we have changed the impact. Instead of improving by 15%, the population has improved by 50%, which results in 55% at endline. And now you can see that we only need 101 households in order to reach statistical significance. So the larger impact you have, the less sample size you will need to show that you've had a significant impact. In addition, your sample size will also depend on dropout. As I explained earlier, dropout rate refers to the number of people that will no longer participate at your endline measurement. Of course, when you increase it to 20%, so you anticipate that 20% of the population that has participated at baseline will no longer participate at endline, then you will need a larger sample size. The larger dropout rate you take into account, the safer you are. But it's usually a good idea to have a look at the literature, to have a look at maybe other projects you have conducted to come up with a realistic dropout rate for your sample size calculation. And then finally, I would like to discuss clustering. Clustering refers to the similarity between people. So we can assume that people from the same village might be more similar to each other than to people from other villages. And in this case, if that is the case, then they are called a cluster. So let me explain this by giving you an example. Let's say there is only one water source in a village, then most or all people in the village will use it. And if you then have a questionnaire and you start asking about contamination of that water source, then all or most people within the village will give you the same answer. This means that they are all quite similar. And this is expressed by ρ, which is called the intra-cluster correlation coefficient. This coefficient can range between 0 and 1, and it gives an indication of how similar your data really are. Now, clusters have a huge impact on your sample size. As you can see, instead of having a mean village size of 100 households, if it increases to 200 households, then you will need twice as much households included in your study. So it's better to have a lot of small clusters than just a few big clusters. This is a value that you can play with in order to reduce your sample size. So what I usually ask people is to work at a village level or a sub-village level instead of working at a district level or a province level. So try to reduce the level you are working in order to reduce your sample size. I know this is a lot of information. I hope it is more or less clear. I will move on to the next part, but if there are any questions, you can always send them through the email address, or we can have a discussion at the end. Next is random selection. It's important to select your sample beforehand. Ideally, you have a list of all households or participants in the area available beforehand, and you randomly, by means of a computer software or online tool, select the sample. Sometimes such lists are available through the government. In other development aid cases, such lists were created by the Belgian Red Cross teams in the weeks before the start of the project. But of course, there are always situations where it is not possible to obtain such a list of households. In those cases, you could use dice or cards while in the field to randomly select households. Or you could go into one house and skip the next, for example, 8 houses, then again enter in one house, skip the next 8 houses, and so on. But whatever you do, try to come up with a random system and make sure that people cannot subjectively select participants. Also, it's important to take the population distribution into account. If we have a look at the example, you can see 4 villages. There is a total population of 1,000 households in village number 1, 500 households in village number 2 and 4, and 100 households in village number 3. Now, if we need to take a sample of 210 households, this sample should be proportionally distributed over the various villages. So 100 in village number 1, 50 in village number 2 and 4, and 10 in village number 3. Outcome measures. This is a very important aspect. First of all, think about what it is you want to know. Try to go beyond inputs and move to outcomes. What I mean by inputs are, for example, the number of clinics you have built, the number of chlorine dispensers that were distributed, the number of vaccines that were provided. While these are important data, I would try to look at the impact you have had as well. Try to measure morbidity, mortality, take water samples, look at behavior, and so on. So try to go beyond the input but move to output. Think about how you want to measure your data. Do you want to use questionnaires? Do you want to use spot checks? Maybe even other tests or measurements that you can use? Also try to focus on the essentials and limit the nice to haves. In my experience, the nice to have data is never properly analyzed and is not used afterwards. Plus, it will just increase your test battery, and participants might not want to participate in another measurement. Formulate your questions as simple and to the point as possible. Don't change your questions over time. If you change your questions or answering possibilities over time, it will become impossible to analyze the data. And also, ideally, you keep your questions and answering possibilities uniform across projects. In this way, you can compare your results from one project to another. Finally, I'm not a very big fan of Likert scales. These data are not always easy to interpret, and especially when you are working with illiterate people or people who have a low education level, we find that these scales are often hard to understand. In many cases, simple yes-no questions could just as easily do the job. And finally, there are a lot of good validated questionnaires out there. I give just a few examples below, but there are plenty more. And as I said earlier, it's not always necessary to reinvent the wheel. You don't have to come up with your own questions. It might be better to use these existing tools or bits and pieces of these existing tools that have been validated. Also, think about how you want to collect your data. Do you want to use paper and pencil? Then know that these are very easy to administer, but you will need some management skills in the field to make sure that you collect all forms and you don't lose any data. Also, someone will need to enter all data into an Excel sheet afterwards, which will require a lot of time and could also lead to some mistakes. Another option is to use an app on your cell phone or tablet. This has the advantage that you can have a look at the data immediately. It allows you to monitor progress in real time. But on the downside, you will need to train people in using this technology appropriately. And one possible tool that we often use is Kobo Collect. Next, people say that with data analysis, you can prove anything. And the truth is that if you do a proper data analysis, this is not the case. I encourage all of you to use a statistical data analysis and use statistical software. So possible statistical softwares are SPSS, SAS, Statistica, and so on. But the downside is that they are quite expensive to get a license. There is also a free software available, which is called RStudio. It's not very user-friendly, so you will need a training to learn how to work with it. But other than that, once you're used to it, it's a very nice tool to work with. I know in the cartoon below, a lot of people think statistics are boring. I'm one of the few who is very enthusiastic about statistics, and I'll try to convince all of you of the importance of using statistical analysis in the next few slides. So here's an hypothetical example. Let's say at baseline, 20% have safe drinking water. Again, we distribute chlorine tablets, and after the intervention, 24% have safe drinking water. The question we ask ourselves is this increase significant? Is this increase important? Does this mean that our intervention was successful? Was it cost effective? I believe that all of these questions cannot be answered if you don't use proper statistics. There's a really important difference between there is an increase over time, which is the case in this hypothetical example, and there is a significant increase over time, which is not very likely in this case. Another example, if you are comparing two groups, the same applies. So let's say at baseline, group 1 has 90% who washes hands, group 2 has 17% who washes hands. And after the interventions, group 1 has 24 people who wash their hands, and group number 2 has 27% who wash their hands. Now, is this difference significant? Is it important? Does this mean that the intervention in group number 2 was more effective than the intervention in group number 1? Again, we cannot answer these questions if we don't use proper statistics. One thing I've come across often in data reports is that people tend to write a report at baseline discussing the baseline data and a different report at endline discussing the endline data. Now, if you would do that with the data of the hypothetical example I gave on the slide, then you would say that there is no difference between 19% and 70% at baseline. And probably at endpoint, you would also conclude that there is no difference between both groups, because a 3% difference is not a lot. They're quite similar. However, if you look at the entire picture, if you look at the changes, then you see that group 1 has only improved 5%, while group number 2 has improved 10%. So by including the changes, by looking at the entire picture, you might conclude that the intervention in group number 2 is more effective. And this is a very important conclusion, because then in the upcoming projects you have going on, you could invest only in the intervention number 2 and no longer in intervention number 1. Okay, so I hope I've made my point that statistical analysis is very important. If you don't have the expertise yourself, you can always consult a statistician to help you with this. Now, some Belgian Red Cross projects we have going on. I will talk about the data collection at mass event first aid posts. We also have a forecast-based financing project ongoing, and data collection following terrorist attacks in Brussels. So the first one is the data collection at mass event first aid posts. This is a national project occurring in Flanders only, and when mass events take place, such as festivals or large sport events, a Red Cross team is always present to provide first aid to those in need. What we did is we collected data at those first aid posts from 2009 to 2016 of all people who entered into these posts and required help. The ultimate goal of this study was to use the data to better predict the number of people that will come in and the type of injuries that they will have, because this will allow us to better prepare logistically. From all this data, we selected 29 events. Each of these events had over 10,000 visitors per day, and these events were subdivided into 6 categories, namely indoor music, outdoor music, indoor electronic dance music, outdoor electronic dance music, city festivals, and sport events. At this point in time, we are analyzing the data. However, we came up with 4 research questions. First of all, we wanted to know the prevalence of triage categories at each type of event, the prevalence of different injuries at each type of event, the preference of transfer to hospital rate at each type of event, and we wanted to use these data to build a prediction model based on the type of event, the number of people attending, the weather conditions, and so on. At the same time, we are working on a systematic review where we are looking for existing classification models for preventive relief actions. And we currently have 12 studies included, and data extraction is ongoing. The goal is to use these models as an important foundation when building our own prediction model. Another project we have ongoing is a forecast-based financing project in Mozambique. Certain areas in Mozambique are known for its cyclones and floods. And the idea is that instead of waiting until the cyclones and floods are over and we have to start rebuilding, is that we provide aid beforehand when we know a cyclone or a flood is coming. And with this aid, we could prevent some damages rather than rebuild. In Mozambique, these cyclones and flood are very common and they occur each year. But this does not mean that we have to take action every time. For this project, we would like to come into action only when the floods and cyclones are particularly severe. So only in the more extreme cases, we will receive a trigger and money will be released to start our preventive actions. At this point in time, no trigger has occurred. We are now collecting data through focus groups, semi-structured interviews, and community visits to collect data on the current impact of floods and cyclones, the current responses to warnings or impacts, the current communication channels, and potential early actions in 3 to 5 days before impact. And these data will be combined with a systematic review to determine possible early actions. In addition, should we receive a trigger and the early actions are activated, then we want to measure whether the trigger was correct and a disaster has in fact taken place, whether the early actions went well, whether any problems occurred, materials were distributed correctly over the entire intervention area, and so on. So we want to evaluate whether our interventions were implemented correctly. One last example are the terrorist attacks that took place in Brussels in March 2016. There were 3 explosions, 2 at the airport around 8 o'clock in the morning, and another one at the subway station 1 hour later. During these attacks, 35 people died and 350 people were injured. Following the attacks, Belgian Red Cross took action immediately. Almost 400 shifts were done by first aid volunteers, and another 248 shifts were done by psychological first aid volunteers. They performed first aid on the scene, provided ambulance services, mortuary transport of deceased victims, organized reception centers for over 3,000 stranded passengers. They created a central information point, were involved in identification support, and held bad news conversations with family members, and so on. Following the attacks, a questionnaire was sent out to the first responders of Belgian Red Cross. The goal of the questionnaire was to know how these first responders were coping with the events and with what they had seen. We sent out the questionnaire 10 days after the attacks, and again after 2 months, 6 months, 12 months, and 18 months. And we have learned a lot from this experience. To sum up, we found out that the questionnaire was too long. We wanted to know too much, which is why many people did not fill in the questionnaire until the end. At the same time, we sometimes regret not asking certain questions. Also, some answering possibilities were changed at some of the later time points, which left some of the data difficult to analyze. I believe most of these issues could have been resolved if we would have had a more elaborate preparation time. And of course, this nicely illustrates exactly how difficult it is to collect data in a disaster setting because that preparation time is often very limited. Okay, so let's leave type A research behind us and move on to type B research. Type B research involves secondary research. This means that you will look to the existing literature to find studies in the topic you are interested in. In order to include secondary research into your daily work, you can either do it the easy way, namely simply find relevant scientific literature and simply start reading, or you can systematically search and summarize evidence, which is better but a lot more complex. So let's start with the easy way. Basically, you should just go to a scientific database and enter a few words in the search bar. For example, water and disaster. And then you can pick some of the papers you are interested in and start reading those. This is an overview of the most important databases I am aware of. We mostly use PubMed, Embase, or the Cochrane Library. Other possible databases that are relevant to the sector are Evidence Aid, ALNAP, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, Rescue, Campbell Library, 3IE, MDAT, Inform, VAM Data, Global Health Observatory, and TRIP. Possibly there are even other databases available. Although I encourage you to read scientific articles and reports, you must keep in mind to avoid cherry picking. The chances are that you will look for results that you want to find, and this will result in a self-fulfilling prophecy. If you have a look at the graph below, the studies on the left of the green line favor intervention, and the studies on the right of the green line favor control. If you are convinced that the intervention works, you might only search for those papers on the left, but forget about those on the right. So be careful with this. As a general rule, try to avoid cherry picking by looking for systematic reviews. If they are not available, try to find several papers on the same topic, and preferably these papers are randomized controlled trials. If you have only one study on a certain topic, don't simply assume that the results of this study are the absolute truth. You have to stay critical. Another way to keep an overall picture of the evidence that is out there is by looking at evidence gap maps. 3IE has created several evidence gap maps, although most of these are in the development aid sector and not necessarily for humanitarian aid. But these gap maps exist for agriculture, WASH, sustainable development, education, and so on. And they are very easy ways to have a look at what evidence is available for which topic. And the map is also dynamic, so you can search by region, country, study design, population, type of technology if you want to. Evidence gap maps are becoming more and more popular. R2HC are even using these gap maps to determine the focus of their funding calls. So based on the graph below, you can see that there is not a lot of research available on water, sanitation, and hygiene. And this is why this year's call has focused on this topic. Another interesting map is the IRC Outcomes and Evidence Framework. The main goal of this framework is not to show research gaps, but it's rather to show you which interventions are available and for which interventions there is evidence available. And it also offers a range of outcomes and indicators that can be used to evaluate your own programs. So if you are looking for questionnaires, the Outcomes and Evidence Framework is a good place to start. Now let's move to the real deal. Systematically search and summarize evidence. How should you get started? First of all, you have to define a research question and the inclusion and exclusion criteria. Next, you develop a search strategy and search in multiple databases. Then you select evidence, extract data, synthesize this data, and assess the quality of the included studies and assign a level of evidence. Defining a research question is ideally done using the PICO format. PICO stands for population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. As an example, a PICO question could be, for survivors of disasters, how many liters of water per person per day are necessary to minimize adverse health effects compared to another amount? Once you have decided on the research question and the research format is in place, it's important to define your inclusion and exclusion criteria. Which type of studies do you want to include? Which ones do you want to exclude? For the research question that we have, a population could be defined as all studies conducted in disasters and refugee camps. As an intervention, we included all studies that involve the provision of a certain amount of water. As a comparison, another amount of water or no water should be provided. And the outcomes involve health-related outcomes such as diarrhea, infectious disease, dehydration, malaria, and so on. As a study design, we chose to include RCTs, before-after studies, cohort studies, and even case control or cross-sectional research. And from a practical point of view, we only want to include English, French, Dutch, and German articles. Once you have defined your research question and your inclusion and exclusion criteria, it's time to start searching for relevant papers. And to do this, you should develop a search strategy. In this case, a search strategy looks something like this. So instead of entering just 2 words, like water and disaster, as we did in the early version, this one is a little bit more complex. As you can see, our search strategy consists of 3 blocks. The blue one refers to the disaster, and it involves terms such as drought, cyclone, flood, hurricane, volcanic eruption, refugee camp, and so on. The green block refers to water, drinking water, water supply, water shortage. And the last one, the red block, refers to the outcomes, such as mortality, morbidity, dehydration, parasite, and so on. These 3 blocks are combined by the command AND, because we want papers who comply to all 3 of these blocks. So we want papers who are related to a disaster, who are related to water, and who have the correct outcome measures included. Then we run this search strategy into different databases. I just summed up a few of the databases here, but of course there's a more elaborate overview earlier on. And so by using such an elaborate search strategy and searching in multiple databases rather than only one database, we can avoid cherry picking and ensure that we include all relevant evidence on a certain topic. So once we run the search, we are left with a lot of papers, namely 3,630 references in this case. And in order to select the relevant papers, there are 3 phases to go through. First of all, we remove all duplicates. Then we screen all references based on title and abstract. And the ones that we would include based on title and abstract are screened a third time based on full text. As you can see in the flowchart, only 6 studies remained and were included in the review. The data from these 6 studies is then extracted, and we extract data related to the methodology, the population, the setting, the intervention, the study design, the outcome, and of course, also the findings. Finally, the quality of the data is also determined, and this is done in 2 phases. First, we determine the risk of bias of each individual study, and next we assign an overall quality to the body of evidence by using grade. Now, I won't go into any detail today, but just know that this is a very important step. You can probably imagine if the quality of your included studies is very low, then you cannot make any firm conclusions. What you really want is to have a lot of high quality studies, and then you can come to a firm conclusion. In the example of water during disasters, there were 6 papers included. And these actually involved guidelines from 6 different organizations. And it simply showed that each organization used a different amount of water, but none of these amounts were based on scientific evidence. We then presented this data to the target population and experts in the field, and they decided that context, culture, and climate are important parameters to make those decisions. In the end, this review is just another nice example of how little research is available in the humanitarian aid sector. Because these 6 different guidelines that exist in the field, it's not clear which one is correct and which one is the one that should be applied. We have several systematic review and guideline projects ongoing at Belgian Red Cross. I will only discuss a few of them. First of all, developing first aid guidelines is one of our core businesses. First aid is a very cost-effective intervention, and it is very important, particularly so in low and middle-income countries or in disaster settings where limited medical services are available. Over the past years, we have developed first aid guidelines for Europe, Africa, India, and Nepal, and there are guidelines for sport injuries, for children, and for first responders. These guidelines are distributed, and trainings are also organized to ensure that the population can be trained in first aid. Just to illustrate that the water systematic review is not an exception, we have also performed a systematic review looking for studies on psychological first aid, and we found no scientific evidence. This means that none of the psychological first aid activities have a scientific background and have proven to be successful. Therefore, I encourage all of you to start collecting data because it's high time to change this trend and to improve scientific evidence. Another project that has just recently started wants to know what the impact is of a disaster on the number of blood donations and blood safety compared to no disaster. Very often when disaster hits, people want to help, and usually we see an increase in the number of people who come to donate blood. However, blood safety is a very important parameter to take into account, and we are suspicious about the fact that all of these new donors are safe, and it's possible that some of these new donors have a higher risk of transfusion transmittable diseases. And this is what we want to figure out with this new systematic review. Should it be the case that new donors have a higher contamination risk, then we could decide in time of disaster to decline all new donors and to only rely on existing donors. But as I mentioned, at this point in time, the search has been finalized and we have only just started the screening phase. Okay, this brings me to the last part of my presentation, how to conduct type C research in a humanitarian aid sector. And type C research involves primary studies, ideally involving a control group. To do this type of research is difficult. It requires methodological know-how, it requires time, and it requires funding. As an illustration, there have been 4,000 rigorous evaluations in low and middle income countries in the last decade. However, only 120 of these have been conducted in conflict and crisis settings. Nevertheless, Such scientific studies are highly needed and very useful, particularly in those areas where there is little or no research available. So how should you get started? Basically, you need to keep in mind all the same things we discussed at type A research. So define your research question, think about sample size, randomization, outcomes, interventions, statistical analysis, and so on. On top of that, you need to obtain an ethical approval, informed consent, and also consider the GDPR law. One of the main comments people have when we talk about performing primary research in a disaster setting is that it would be unethical. And I agree that when we would compare an intervention group who gets a lot of help to a control group who receives no help, that this is unethical and something we simply cannot do. However, there are some alternatives possible. We could, for example, compare a basic intervention to a group who gets a basic intervention and something extra. Or we could compare intervention A to intervention B. If we think about the systematic review about water, for example, we could decide to distribute 15 liters per person per day to one group and distribute 20 or 30 liters per person per day to another group, and then look at the impact this one has on health. In any case, if you perform research with humans, you must always ask ethical approval, and there is an independent committee who will then decide whether or not your study is ethical. The need for an ethical approval has originated from World War II, where Josef Mengele and many other Nazi doctors have performed gruesome, non-ethical experiments on humans. In the case of Josef Mengele, I know he has dissected a 1-year-old boy while he was still alive and awake. I know that he has injected blue dye in the eyes of several children to see whether he could turn them into Aryan people. And these are just a few examples. So in order to stop this, an ethical code was founded. So some of these doctors were convicted during the Nuremberg trials, and these trials also led to the development of a Nuremberg Code. This was the first ethical code to exist. Later on, in 1964, the Declaration of Helsinki was developed, and this declaration was signed by various countries, and it is a morally binding document. In brief, it states that you should respect the individual, you should have the right to self-determination, and the right to make informed decisions. The Declaration of Helsinki has been updated 9 times over the past few years. According to this declaration, ethical approval is obligated when performing clinical trials and for experiments with vulnerable populations, such as minors. One could also argue that victims of a disaster are also a vulnerable population, particularly so if these disasters take place in low and middle income countries and people are illiterate and have a low overall education level. In addition, many scientific journals actually require ethical approval if you wish to publish your research, and it has become very customary within academics to get ethical approval before the start of the study. Every university has its own ethical committee. A research protocol should contain an introduction and a method section, and also you should describe all ethical considerations related to your research involving legislation, risks, benefits, informed consent, dropout, confidentiality, and how you will inform your participants. Another important element of doing research is the informed consent. The valid elements relate to disclosure, capacity of the subject to understand the project and to provide consent, and voluntariness. It's important to describe within the informed consent the purpose of the study, the methods and interventions, the risks and benefits. Maybe there will be a financial compensation, confidentiality and privacy, voluntariness, and you should also provide your own contact information should they have follow-up questions. Finally, I would like to very briefly discuss the new GDPR regulation. The most important thing you need to know is that GDPR does not need to be scary, although it can be a hassle. What you should know is that yes, we are still allowed to collect data, and yes, we are still allowed to collect personal data. However, due to this new regulation, the rules have slightly changed. We can only collect data on a need-to-know basis and should not include nice-to-haves. We should use the data for intended purposes and should not create new research questions post hoc. The reason for this is that the participants have not consented for these other research topics. They have only consented for you to use the data as was described in the informed consent. And finally, data management should be transparent, reliable, and safe. And this brings a lot of hassle with it because in the digital age, we store data on our computers and we need a lot of IT support to make sure that these data are safe. At this point in time, we have no type A research project going on in humanitarian aid. However, we have already organized a few brainstorm meetings and are currently deciding on a primary topic of focus. There are several possible trajectories, such as the usefulness of simulation exercises, the effectiveness of wash kits, and the most effective way to spread information in order to prevent contamination of Ebola, for example. I can give you an example of a project that is ongoing within development aid. Even within this setting, and I agree that it is nothing compared to a disaster setting, but we still come across several challenges. For example, we try very hard to follow up on the randomization. So we have selected a random sample of the total population, and we have also divided this sample into various interventions. And it's difficult to monitor whether the people in the field are applying this randomization correctly. We are therefore in close collaboration with the Tanzania Red Cross Society and with Belgian delegates in the field. Also, receiving ethical approval in Tanzania was not self-evident. It required a lot of time and a lot of paperwork. And these are just a few examples of the challenges we have come across. So far, we have been able to manage all of these challenges, and I have a very good feeling about the research project. And we believe that the expertise we have gained from this RCT will help us to develop primary studies in a disaster setting as well. To conclude, I hope I have convinced you that Belgian Red Cross uses scientific evidence and data collection to inform its interventions, to identify evidence gaps, and if evidence gaps are identified, to then prioritize primary field studies. There are three types of research that are used. Type A, which involves collecting data on existing projects. Type B, which involves secondary research. And type C, which involves setting up a primary field study with an intervention and a control group. Research in a disaster setting is difficult, but it's not impossible. So we should all strive to collect more data because future research is needed to ensure that humanitarian aid becomes more effective. Finally, I would like to thank you all for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.